RHAMBOE102615P3 assessment.
I'm Laura Sherman, I'm Director of Curriculum Instruction Assessment and Instructional Technologies here at RHAMBOE. We're going to give you a quick presentation that talks about the assessments that were done over last year and the ones that are going to happen next year. Just to give you an overview of what the results are. Most of the results of the various assessments that we've had have already been reported out in all kinds of publications, but we're going to bring them all in here together to talk about the specifics of how RAM did on these different assessments. There are a couple of terms that I'll throw around to start with. I know you had a chance to look at this already, but we talk about formative assessment versus summative assessment. Formative assessment is something that is happening as part of instruction. There's been a lot of discussion in the last couple of years about over-testing and having instruction stopped in order to have days and days and days of testing happen. The summative assessments are assessments in which instruction stops so that we can see what happened in the unit or the years that went before. Some of the assessments that we do locally, some of the things that we do here within the building are not summative assessments, they're formative. The word assessment has kind of begun to be a dirty word, that somehow it means something awful. But the truth is, with instruction, if you are not assessing in some way, you don't know whether your instruction is successful. We want it to be happening as a part of instruction, not stopping the instruction. Most of the tests we're going to talk about, the results here, are standardized tests. That means that the test takers are answering the same basic types of questions, although there are adaptive tests, and I'll talk about that in a minute. In the same way, it's scored in a consistent way so that you can make relative performance statements about how people did on this test in more than one class or in more than one place. A lot of our local assessments are not standardized in that sense, that we are giving different assessments to different classes, and the way they are being graded is not done in a completely objective way, in the way that multiple choice tests that the state and some of the other assessments that students take in a standardized setting are. That doesn't necessarily make one better or worse, but it's important to know the kind of test that somebody is taking. There are two formats for some of the big standardized assessments, performance tasks, and you will also hear talk about a computer adaptive test. The performance task is asking students to actually use their knowledge to show their understanding. As I say in the slide, there are traditional task asks, do you know this? Which is an entirely different question from can you apply it? And in some of the more recent tests, assessments, there is a performance task aspect to it. The Smarter Balance assessment in both ELA literacy portion and the math portion had a performance task that asked students to take their knowledge and apply it. In the CAPT and the CMT, the performance task was limited, and certainly the math was barely present. The other aspect of the Smarter Balance test and the NWA test that we'll talk about in a minute is the computer adaptive piece, which means the students are being given multiple choice questions. When they respond, if the student gets the question correct, it asks them a more difficult question from its question bank, and will continue to do that until the student reaches a point at which roughly 50% of the questions they're asked, they're answering incorrectly. If the student doesn't get the question correct, it will ask them progressively easier questions until you reach the same point. That doesn't mean that everybody gets the same score, 50% right, 50% wrong. Because they are graded on their difficulty, you wind up with a score that says whether or not the student is meeting the expectations for that grade level. Obviously, a computer adaptive test only takes place if you're on the computer. A paper and pencil test cannot adapt to the student's performance. So, we have a couple of scores to talk about. Overall, again, these things have been reported out in various publications. The ACT, the College Aptitude Test, and also a knowledge test, the American College Testing. The scores that came out, 80 students at RAM took it. This was a test that used to be much more popular in the Midwest than on either of the coasts, but it's becoming more popular for college students. So 80 students in the state, 13,000 students. The scores are on a scale up through 36. There's a whole metric that goes along with them. 4 tests, one of English, one of math, one of reading, one of science. You can see the scores here. Let you see that our RAM average is above the state average in all of those categories, and is on a par with some of the best schools within the state. The other piece with the ACT is they give us a score that talks about college readiness. This is something that the ACT puts together. They have taken over the years with their data and come up with a score for each one of these 4 tests that their information shows. If a student is scoring at this number, a student is likely to have a 75% chance of a C or better in this type of course, a 50% chance of a B or better in this type of course. So a student who in the English test gets a score of 18 is likely to, 75% of those students are likely to have a score of at least a C, 50% a score of at least a B in their college classes. They have these numbers by students fill out the information, and then they follow up on them over the next several years to see how well they do. At RAM, 94% of our students wound up with a score that was at least that high, versus the state's 86%. For students who are taking the math test, if they get a score of 22, most of them are going to pass a college algebra class. On social sciences, they look at the reading test. Students with a reading score of 22 are likely taking a social science class at college to get a B or better. And as you can see with all of the scores there, and college biology looks at the science test, as you can see with all of the scores there, RAM outstrips the state. The meeting all 4 is a single student getting those scores or better for all 4 of them. We have quite a few students, not just for us, but for the state as well, who will do very well in one area, English and reading, not so well in math and science, or the flip. So you see the numbers a little bit lower for a student who can do well on all 4. The ACT is also used for younger students. Sometimes 7th and 8th graders will take the test, and they use those scores as a means of students going on to do some gifted and talented programs, one run by Johns Hopkins and Northwestern and other places as well. And a number of our students take those tests. The SAT is the other college aptitude test, scholastic aptitude test. These are the scores from last year. Our average scores, again, you'll see, above the state. And the interesting number with this is 200 plus Connecticut high school schools have their scores reported, and our scores rank as 20th out of those 200. It's an interesting number, given that we're a DERG C school. There are a total of 30 schools in DERG A and DERG B, another 30, 60 schools altogether in DERG A, B, and C, the economic resource groups. We're scoring 20th, which means we're outperforming a number of schools with higher resources than we have. Now, while these are good scores, there's lots of room for us to help our students to do better. And these are scores on the SAT that will no longer exist. We have a new SAT that is happening this year, which is asking slightly different types of questions. We'll see whether we have the same type of performance or better. AP exams were reported recently as well. We had 322 distinct separate tests that were taken. 282 of those had a score of 3, 4, or 5, which is the scores that colleges require in order to give credit. The percentage of that is 87.6% of the students at RAM who took an AP test received a score that will give them college credit. And again, out of those 200, just over 200 Connecticut high schools, we ranked 18th for that.
The 322, how does that compare to the number of students taking those courses? How many students that are taking AP courses?
Who actually took the test? I off the top of my head, I don't have the exact number, but I do know from having looked at the majority of our students, most of our students who take an AP class take the test. But we could get the number for you. It's probably, there are probably 20, 30 kids who will have taken course, an AP course, and not have taken the test, but the majority of them take it.
I know, talking from stats, that he will tell students that are likely not going to pass, that don't take the test, you get thrown away a substantial amount of money.
Well,
I'm hoping we do that on all our courses.
Well, I will say that for most of the AP classes that students go to take, most of them are doing well on them. We don't tend to have students with lower grades on them. Again, I'm sure there are cases in which that is not true, but I don't have the exact number. We could find it out.
There are kids who don't take the AP classes, that take the AP exam also.
Yes, we do. We also have students who, for some classes that we either don't offer, or we will have a student who, because of scheduling reasons, can't take the AP class, but can take the honors science class. They're getting the information they need, studying on their own, and taking the test. We give a standardized computer adaptive test called the NWEA, which we give in grade 7 and grade 8. We do also use it in the high school for 2 small groups of students for our reading support and our math support classes, but we do give it to all of our incoming 7th graders. We do that in part because we're coming from 3 feeder schools. It's a diagnostic test that lets us see where students' reading levels and math levels are when they walk in the door, rather than having to wait until we get a few weeks or a few months into the school and see how they're performing, so that we can identify students who are doing well below a particular level, because frankly, grades are not always reliable as a measure for that. This is not a criterion reference test, it's a norm reference test. The Smarter Balance, CMT, the CAP had a reference point for the criteria that said, this is what passing looks like. All the NWA tells you is, of all of the students in grade 7 across the United States who took this test, their average score in reading was, at the beginning of the year, a 214. Doesn't tell you whether that's a good score. Doesn't tell you whether that's what you want your students to learn, where you want your students to be. That's just the average of all the kids who took it. We outscore the national norm, which would be a predictable place to be, because the majority of students who are taking this test are still coming from underperforming urban districts, which is where the test was initially used. Ideally, it's used as a growth test. We give it at the beginning of the year and again at the end of the year, and it lets you see how students have moved forwards with it. However, once students are in the middle school and high school levels, there are particular emotional feelings about the test that they're taking can get in the way of an accurate measurement of their growth. Not to mention that while this test claims to be aligned with Common Core skills, most of the Common Core skills refer to a performance aspect. How well do students write? How well do they solve a problem? Not how well do they pick a multiple choice answer to a problem. The NWA is entirely a multiple choice test. It can give you absolutely no information about a student's writing skills, even though it says that it does, because students don't write. So it can't tell you how well they write when what they're doing is going through and picking an answer about what a well-written sentence looks like. As you might tell from my tone about this, I'm not a fan of this test. But it can give you some information that is useful. It's worth our continuing to give it and to spend the money to give it. It gives us a Lexile level for students when they come in the door, so we know how well they read. And it also lets us see, compare to each other from 3 separate towns where we don't always know exactly what they know, where they stand. Is there a question? Yeah?
That's an average, so what's the high number?
The number in reading and math can go up to 250, 260, and as low as, I think the lowest score is something like 105. Each one of those are normed for a particular grade level. One of the things that the NWE does, because it's a computer adaptive test, is you don't take a different test when you are in grade 7 or grade 8 or grade 9. The test is the test. And the questions that you answer get progressively harder depending on whether you answer them correctly or not. So it doesn't top out the way some other tests do. So we have, I think, in the either 7th or 8th grade, a student with a reading score of 245, 250 would be somebody who is scoring at the same place as the national norm test for a student in 11, 12, or above. But again, it's one test, multiple choice, doesn't tell you anything about the student's ability to apply those skills to a real-world performance aspect.
Or just one question
Yeah.
along those lines. Because the standalone test, I get it, the standalone test based on how it's configured, can only measure within the definitions of what that test is designed to do. But I know when Hebron schools looked at their assessments, they also use NWEA. They actually compared their NWEA results to their SBAC results and found that there was indeed a correlation between the results, even though the two tests are measuring completely different things. And it's a good idea statistically to look to see, is something going to produce a leading indicator that will help us? Are we doing that same type of analysis?
Well, we go through and we can look at these and do a comparison between the student scores and how successful they are at different levels of classes. We actually used this score once we didn't have the CMT scores anymore. We've made use of the NWEA score as a predictor of success going into honors or level 1 for English and for math. While I've not done the research to connect it to the Smarter Balance test here, where I worked last, we did extensive research on whether or not these scores were predictors for the CMT and for the TAP, and found that while there was some correlation between the math scores within middle school, we found almost no correlation between the reading scores and the performance on the performance pass basis of it. We saw some correlation between the performance on this test and the multiple choice portion of the test, but it doesn't tell you anything about the student's ability to actually do the task. So as we continue having the Smarter Balance test in grade 7 and grade 8, we'll look at whether or not this can tell us something about it. The other thing that is the case with how the NWA is set up, if you're in an elementary school setting, you've got 20, maybe 25 students. The way the data is produced from the NWA, in order to get all of the information from it, you have to literally print out 15 pages, put them up on a roll, tape together, take the marker and draw lines through it in order to collect all of it and look at it overall. You can manage that and to dig down and get all that data about individual students when you have 20. In a middle school setting or a high school setting, you have 100 or 120. It's not user-friendly from that aspect. All of that said, that score right there, if we have a student who on the initial grade 7 reading score has a score of 205, we know before we get much further down the road that that is a student with some difficulties in reading, or is a student who has some difficulty in agreeing to do their best on a test. Either way, we have a student with some issues and we know that right away. But if the student scores at 214 and our school average is 222, we don't really know very much. And a score at that average is likely to see a score similarly in an average range on most tests, because most of these are on some level kind of ability to take tests. Tells you some of those things. Again, because it's not criterion referenced, I don't see them as being tremendously useful. It's part of why we don't use them in grade 9 and grade 10, other than for students who are struggling, where it is very useful for students who are way below grade level to measure progress. Smarter Balance tests. So the numbers here are the percentage of students who scored at a 3 or 4 level, which is either meeting the achievement level or exceeding it. You can see the state averages for grade 7, grade 8, grade 11 in ELA and in math. In grade 7 and grade 8, as we talk about this and we talk about the next one as well, I want to be sure that everybody sees how well the middle school is doing compared to the state averages on this particular test. They far exceed the state averages in grade 7 and grade 8 ELA and in grade 7 and grade 8 math as well.
Question, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm wondering when this was first initiated and when we put the testing the first time, we said we weren't going to be spending too much time looking at the scores because, you know, this is so new. Like, is that, like, when we're looking at these scores, are we to attribute the fact that, I mean, I'm thinking it's great that the middle school is doing so well in ELA, just wondering if we had done poorly, would we have qualified it and said that, you know, it's the first couple of years and we're not gonna,
Even with this is our baseline.
okay, this is basically.
This is our baseline. There was the practice pilot field test that happened the year before, where we didn't get the same kind of numbers back from the state. This is our baseline, and grade 7 and grade 8 is going to continue to have this assessment happen for the foreseeable future. This lets us look at and say, this is where our students are performing on this type of assessment. And so this is our expectation of their ability to perform at this level, and we are not going to teach to this test. You can't teach to this test. This test does not have formulaic aspects to it. We will teach to the standards. When you teach to the standards, which are about the higher level critical thinking skills that are embedded in those core standards, students will perform well on any assessment that you put in front of them. Now, you're looking at our junior scores on this, as we did as well, and see that our juniors performed rather than above the state average, roughly the same as the state average, a little below it for the junior year. I can give you all sorts of speculations about why that is.
These are the same students, right? The 84% that sort of demonstrated college readiness for math, right? And the SAT. These are the same kids that were told it doesn't matter.
These are our seniors this year.
Yes, correct.
So we have these other assessments that you just looked at that say that the majority of our students are college and career ready. We know from anecdotally, from talking to the juniors, that if you asked most of them, did you give it your all when you took that test, they would laugh at you. Because most of them were not thinking of this as meaningful to them in any way. Sound about right? Yeah. So, right? No shame there. We know that we had plenty of students who did try as hard as they could just because they wanted to. But in terms of, and really you can't blame students for this, they are taking an assessment that while it is a graduation requirement that they take the assessment, it's not a graduation requirement that they get a particular score on the assessment. They're taking the SATs, they're taking the ACTs, and they know those scores are going to count for them for college, and they're putting their attention into that. Now, we did this year, unlike last year, unlike our pilot year, we had near 100% participation in it. Students came, they sat down, they took the test. Some of them will tell you that they just kept pressing C and they just moved on to the next thing. If this were going to become like the CAT, if we were going to say that we wanted our students to demonstrate their best skill on this, and that we were going to hold them accountable by saying if you couldn't show us that you could perform at a certain level, at a 3 or a 4, we were going to say that you would not prove that you were college and career ready, and that we were going to make you jump through some other hoop, I would say that my prediction would be that we would see a significantly increased score. That said, we have grade 7 and grade 8 students who have spent at least half of their educational lives being taught with a reference towards doing that kind of independent work, doing an application of their skills to writing that was not formulaic. And the majority of our juniors have spent most of their time in a setting in which the writing they were being taught to do on a test was along the lines of CMP and CAT, which is entirely formulaic.
Yeah, but that I'm not sure if the last explanation, well, I think is true. I think the rest of the state, as 11th graders, have also been instructed, and typically on CAP testing, Connecticut Mastery, et cetera, we have scored better than the majority of the states. So I think the earlier explanation probably,
Well, but I think that is true, but this new test did not ask for formulaic
Yeah.
writing.
yeah.
So we're having our students perform at the same level, in this case, with the rest of the state, rather than outperforming the state. Now, I can't, I really don't know that, it's entirely speculation. For all I know, if every one of our students had given it their all, we would see the same kinds of scores that we saw from the middle school where these students did do their best on it because they're still in a place where when their teachers are telling them that this is important and they should do it, they don't roll their eyes quite so often at them and say, I'm not going to bother. They actually commit to it.
No, we do have at least I have a concern there.
Sure.
As I mentioned to you before, is that this is a new test.
Yeah.
The PSATs and the SATs are now this new
Yes.
test. Our juniors just completed the PSATs
Yep.
with the new style. Those are the juniors that don't have the experience at the time before.
That said, neither the PSAT nor the SAT ask them to do a performance task. It does not ask them to demonstrate their ability to apply that knowledge to writing, to solving a problem where they don't have a multiple choice answer. Now, it's been altered a little bit.
On that.
What's that?
We'll get an answer, November, December for the PSAT.
Yes, when we get the scores back, we'll see how they did on this slightly revised test. And again, this year's juniors will be taking the revised SAT, which has some slightly different types of questions, doesn't penalize for wrong answers anymore, and has multiple choice questions that instead of being a sort of hunt and peck in the reading comprehension questions, require that you read the whole thing and analyze the answer before you respond. And we'll see. That test, we should also see for our students. Most of them are highly invested in doing well in it. They want the score. So we'll get a better sense with this year's baseline. And we're reporting the numbers because that's what they are. But this year's SAT, which is going to be the standardized test going forward, will become our baseline for our juniors.
And the results of that get sent to us
As soon as we have them back.
because there's a real short window between those students taking the PSATs and turning around and taking SATs.
I have one other set of numbers that I think is important for people to look at. You get to see these are the scores from Hebron, Marlborough, and Andover for their 6th grades versus RHAM's score in grade 7. It lets you see that the scores are disparate, particularly in math. And that if you average the math scores for Hebron, Marlborough, and Andover, the average would be a 62.7. RHAM in 7th grade is scoring slightly above that. You can see while the ELA scores for the 3 feeder schools for grade 6 were very good, and for some of them, if you looked at the scores of grade 4 and grade 5, were performing even better. But those students come into RHAM, and the scores that you're seeing there for RHAM's grade 7 are, they do a wonderful job in taking a group of students coming from some very different areas and getting a good result from it.
Have you investigated why he didn't bring in our scores down?
We had meetings with, actually, we had a meeting with the principals relatively recently. That was not a topic that anybody was eager to discuss. But yeah, we're going to be talking with them about, we actually have the curriculum and the curriculum changes that people are looking at. But no, we don't have a statement from them about an explanation for what that is. I'm sure they have what that's about, but we haven't looked into that. So included in the slide so that you can look at it at your leisure are 2 slides that come from the state to go through and explain the smarter balance. And the basic point here is that it is useful for you to look at the student performance on this test. It lets you measure their progress up until this particular point, and it is supposed to be helping us to see whether or not they are college and career ready. But there are some things that it is not. This is not the results on these tests are not something, as I said before, that we're using to decide how we're going to teach. Our curriculum is based on the standards, and if we teach to those standards, we're going to see what we saw from grade 7 and grade 8. We're going to see our students perform well on any kind of a test. The state itself recognizes that this is not the kind of exam that you can teach to. In the CMT and the CAP, there were questions that you could drill a student in doing so that they would perform well. There is no such question on the Smarter Balance. In order for students to do well on this test, they need to be taught to think. They need to be taught to respond independently to prompts. You cannot give them a formula that will work. We also give local assessments, and that is as important to us as the standardized tests, and most of the time more important. Every department, grade 7 through 12, gives a benchmark at the beginning of the year, again at the end of the year, that is measuring the important skills for that particular discipline area. And those are assessments that were created in-house and are scored in-house. And then the departments at the end of the year review them and look at whether or not students are performing the way we want them to perform. That, together with the standardized tests, can give us a picture of a student's ability to perform on a variety of tasks. One by itself doesn't do it so well. We also have unit assessments along the way, midterms and finals. These are summative. The unit assessments, midterms and finals are summative tests. The benchmarks are generally used as formative. Many of the departments don't include them in the grade because it's not something that you are teaching towards. You're measuring the student progress. We also do portfolios, both at the end of 8th grade and again at the end of the year, which lets students put all of their work together. And we think that together, all of those assessments give you a picture of a student's ability. And we want to be very sure that we are never focusing just on a single snapshot, but the whole photo.
We have no idea how many hours kids spend doing the assessment test, not the returns and the class test.
Yeah, well, we took a look at some of that last year. Part of why I can't just give you an answer on it is that we keep changing what it is that we do. We've eliminated some things. The NWEA, up until this year, was given 3 times a year. Was given in the fall, then again in the winter, and then again in the spring. We've gotten rid of the winter test because we're not using it for anything. If we're not going to use the test in order to guide instruction or to give us a snapshot of the school performance as a whole, we're not going to give it. So we are still giving the NWA in the fall and the spring because we do use this as a diagnostic for struggling students, but we pulled the winter test out for that reason. The SATs and the PSATs are 4-hour exams that take place on a single day versus what we had in the past. Smarter Balance we did over the course of 4 days at the high school. It's still about 4 or 5 days for each grade, although now that we have the one-to-one in the middle school, we don't have to spread it out so long. Overall, the test altogether is 6 hours, about 6 hours worth of testing. And we do it over the course of a day or 2 in order to spread that out. The SAT will be a single 4-hour test. If you remember when we had the CMTs and the CAP, for all of it, that was usually we took 2 weeks in order to get all of that accomplished. We still have to do the CMT and the CAP. The PSAT and not the PSAT, but the SAT is our required standardized test. The Smarter Balance is the required standardized test for grade 7 and grade 8. So this year, well, we already gave the PSAT to the juniors in October. The sophomores will take the PSAT 10 in February. The juniors will take the SAT in March. CAP Science, CMT Science, and the Smarter Balance will happen for grade 7 and grade 8. And for the sophomores during the window in March, we still don't have the specifics of how the state is going to provide